Today we're going to talk about exactly how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed all work together to control the exposure of your image, and how do you use these in real life applications to create beautiful, engaging videos. So first we need to understand one thing. What is exposure? Exposure is the brightness of your image, how bright or how dark your image is. If you have too much light hitting your sensor, your image is going to be overexposed. If you have too little light hitting your camera's sensor, your image is going to be underexposed. The main way you can tell if your image is overexposed is if you look in the highlights of your image, the brightest parts of your image, you can't see any details in there. That's what's called being overexposed, and the highlights are clipping. Underexposed simply means you're losing details in the shadows, and your image might not look as natural as you want it to look. So essentially the goal when you're exposing for an image, what I mean when I say exposing for an image, that means just simply means stepping through your camera settings and changing the brightness of your image. The ultimate goal is to have a balanced exposure for your image. What this means is you can see all the details in your highlights outside of a few shooting scenarios like, when you're shooting and the sun is in the image. Nobody wants to see or can see the details of the sun. It's just too bright, and that's okay. And you also want to be able to see details in the shadows, unless you're making a creative choice to have a more contrasty image and get a specific look. So the first part of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO essentially controls how bright and how dark your image is in the way of adjusting the sensor inside of your camera, the sensitivity of your sensor. So the higher you raise your ISO, the brighter your image gets, and the more grain is introduced into your image. The lower your ISO gets, the darker your image will be, and you'll ultimately have less grain in your image. Your image will be cleaner. The second part of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So you'll see shutter speed measured in 1 over some number on the bottom of the fraction. So a typical shutter speed someone would shoot in would be 1 over 48. So if you see 1 over 48, if you raise your shutter speed to 1 over 60, your image is going to get darker and your motion blur is going to lessen. And vice versa, when you lower your shutter speed to, let's say, 1 over 30, there will be more motion blur and your image will get brighter. As a general rule of thumb, to get the most natural motion blur, you'll want to keep your shutter speed at double your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, you'll want to get your shutter as close as possible to 1 over 48 frames per second. And a rule of thumb for shutter speed in video, if you want to have the most natural looking motion blur, you should keep your shutter speed double your frame rate. So let's say you're shooting in 24 frames per second, which I am right now. You'll want to have your shutter speed as close as possible to 1 over 48, and that will give you the most natural motion blur. The third part of the exposure triangle is aperture. What does aperture do? The lower your aperture, the brighter your image. The higher your aperture, the darker your image. Also, the lower your aperture, the more blurry the background is, and the higher the aperture, the less blurry the background is, and the more that will be in focus. And here's how you would use that in a real-world shooting scenario. Let's say you're shooting portraits, a portrait video of somebody, and you want the background to be really blurry. You'll want to set your aperture at like a standard 2.8, or if your lens can allow to go lower, all the way down to maybe a 1.2, that will let more light in, and that will also make the background more blurry and cinematic is the word that people like to use. But let's say you're shooting landscape in this other scenario. You'll actually want to have more in focus. So what you'll need to do is set your aperture to f8 or f11 or even f22 if you want all of everything that is in the image that is being shown to be in focus. Now that I've kind of given you a comprehensive overview of what each part of the exposure triangle is and how it works and what they're used for, here's how they work together. All three parts of the exposure triangle control how bright or dark your image is, but each kind of has a side effect if you go too far on it. So like I talked about earlier, if you raise your ISO too high, it will introduce grain. And we talked about grain in a previous video where I talked more in depth about ISO and how it works. You should go check that out. Shutter speed, like I talked about earlier, affects motion blur. So if you lower your shutter speed too much, it will create this dreamy look that maybe you're not going for that kind of look. So you'll have to adjust accordingly. And like I said earlier, aperture affects depth of field, which is essentially how much is in focus on your focal plane. I've also made a video about focal plane. You'll have to go check that video out if you want to learn more about that. So the idea of the exposure triangle is that you need to understand exactly what all three parts of the exposure triangle do to help you make or achieve a specific look of how you want your video to come across. So when you adjust one of these pieces of the exposure triangle, you'll likely need to adjust the other two to compensate for the adjustments that you made on this one. So here's an example scenario that will help you kind of understand this better. So you're shooting an interview inside, and the aperture is wide open at f1.8. Your shutter speed is at 1/50th of a second. So you're trying to get that natural motion blur, and you're shooting at 24 frames per second. And your ISO is set to 800. And inside, your exposure looks great. Looks very even, you're getting a very balanced image. So then the next part of the shooting day, you're shooting outside. So you keep all of your settings the same. All you do is move outside, and your subject is now sitting in a much brighter environment. So now your image is overexposed because you have more light entering and hitting the sensor than you did previously when you were inside. So your first thought, oh, maybe I can adjust the shutter speed. You don't want to do that because you want the specific look to come across. You want natural looking motion blur because this is an interview. You're not trying to achieve a specific look. So you can adjust your shutter speed. Another option to adjust the exposure for when you moved from these different environments is you could close down your aperture to f8, which means a darker image, more balanced image, but it also means you're not getting as much separation from the background for your subject. Your background is not as blurry. And depending on the look you're wanting to go for, that could be bad. So what I've explained thus far, this whole scenario, this is exactly why you need to understand exactly what the three parts of the exposure triangle do and how you use them. Now here's a little bit of a pro tip. In this example that I've just laid out for you, what I would do in this scenario is I would have a variable ND filter. It's called a variable neutral density filter. This is a filter that is essentially sunglasses for your lens. So it allows you to essentially screw it on to the front of your lens, and you set the amount of ND, neutral density, that you want by twisting the variable ND filter, and it gets darker and brighter. So you can knock down the exposure, so then you can still have your aperture wide open at whatever you'd like. So you still have a lot of light coming in, but the neutral density filter allows you to keep the correct shutter speed as well. So you can have a good shutter speed with correct motion blur that looks natural, and you can have that nice blurry background that everybody loves. So this is kind of how I would recommend going about setting and adjusting the three components of the exposure triangle. First, set your aperture. Decide on what look you want. Do you want more separation from the background for your subject, or do you want less separation from the background? Are you maybe shooting in a house with your subject who's sitting down for an interview, and you want to show off the kind of environment around them so people can kind of get an idea of who this person is? Or do you want separation for your subject? It's really up to you. And then for your shutter speed, depending on what frame rate you're shooting in, which typically for an interview or most standard shots, regular motion, you'll be shooting in 24 frames per second. Second, after you set your aperture, you should set your shutter speed. And if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you should set your shutter speed at 1/48. So here's how I would kind of go about adjusting the exposure triangle for a shot like this. Here's the order in which I would prioritize each component of the exposure triangle. I always set my ISO first. And I always prioritize the ISO, setting it as low as possible. The reason that I do this is because the ISO determines exactly how clean your image is going to be. And I would like a clean video, as clean as possible for all of my videos, if I have the choice. Which in a scenario like this, where I get to control the light, I do have that choice. I set my ISO. In this case, I set it to 100, which is very, very low. So that means I have to adjust my light accordingly to expose my image. And we'll talk about lighting in a future video as well. So this light I have set to 100%. So what that means, after I set my ISO, I set my light, and I make sure I have a good even exposure on my subject. For this scene, I didn't really need to prioritize a blurry background because it's pretty simple, but I would adjust my aperture next. If I wanted, let's say I wanted to do like a really, really blurry background, I would set that down to like 1.2 if I had a lens that could accommodate. And then after that, I would determine what frame rate I'm shooting in, and if I'm not doing any slow motion or anything like that, I'm going to set it for 23.98 frames per second, which is 24 frames per second. And once I have all of my settings set, I will then adjust my light accordingly and then check the histogram on my monitor to see what the correct exposure is. And we'll learn about histograms more in a later video. So that's a comprehensive look on the exposure triangle and how to properly use it to shoot beautiful videos. My name is Hayden Cornfloss, and I am an in-house video producer for an 8-figure national brand. And this channel exists to teach you how to do exactly what I do. So if that's something that you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our weekly videos. And I will see you in the next one.